While lists of religious texts were being finalized in Europe, deciding which books would remain and which would be removed, some Ethiopian monks in the mountains of Africa were doing just one thing: preserving what they had found as it was. And today's video is different. Imagine asking an AI a simple question. What does the Ethiopian Bible actually say about Jesus' resurrection from the dead? Usually, the answer is the same as we've heard in church since childhood: miracles, joy, and then the end. But Grok didn't give that answer. Instead of repeating the same old lines, the AI presented texts most people have never even heard of. And then something struck me like a bolt of lightning. The Ethiopian Bible contains 88 books, not 66. That means there are 22 texts missing from the Western Bible. The question isn't why they're different. The question is why we weren't told about them. Grok's answer didn't feel like a theory, but rather like someone had opened a closed door. And inside lay things you'd never read, so you couldn't even ask questions. The AI didn't make any predictions. It simply read old words, but those words raised new questions. Now think, if the real events after the resurrection were in those 22 books, why were we told an incomplete story for years? And the truth that's now emerging will force you to think completely differently. See, Elon Musk's Grok AI was asked about the resurrection of Jesus in the Ethiopian Bible, and the answer it gave was astonishing. Subscribe to our channel to discuss this in detail, as very few channels provide such knowledge, so your subscription motivates us. When we talk about the Bible, most people think of only one number: 66 books. This is what we were told in church, and this is what's found in most Western Bibles. But the story isn't straightforward. The Ethiopian Bible contains not 66 books, but 88. This means that there are 22 texts that are not present in the Western Bible. The difference here isn't just a number. The difference between 66 and 88 isn't just 22, but a matter of thought, history, and what was included and what was excluded. The 66 books in the Western Bible were selected centuries ago and placed into a fixed list. However, the Ethiopian Church maintained its own canon. There are two main versions: a longer version, containing 81 books, and a shorter version, containing 72 books. Later, Emperor Haile Selassie made the shorter version, containing 72 books, official. But note, 72 is also more than 66. This means that the shorter version is also longer than the Western Bible. The question now arises, where did these 22 books go? Did they suddenly disappear? Or was it decided at some point that some texts were essential and others were not? The Ethiopian Bible includes texts like Enoch, Jubilees, and the Book of the Covenant, which early Christians read. But when the Western Church established its final canon, these books were not included in that list. When people hear about the Ethiopian Bible or its ancient manuscripts, many people think it's a new discovery, as if something just emerged from a dusty cave. But the truth is quite different. Ethiopia is not a new chapter, but a very old root of Christian history. Ethiopia has been officially a Christian country since the 4th century, and this means that the Christian tradition has been continuously prevalent there for over 1,600 years. This is not something recent or hidden. Interestingly, Ethiopia's Christian history is considered to predate the formal structure of the Catholic Church. When many parts of Europe were not yet fully Christianized, churches, monasteries, and religious traditions were already strong in Ethiopia, and tradition there connects itself to Menelik I, believed to be the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This story is not just a matter of religious pride, but also demonstrates that Ethiopia considers itself directly connected to the biblical world, not through European missionaries. A 6th century traveler, Cosmas Indicopastes, visited Ethiopia during his travels and recorded it as a deeply Christian country. At that time, Christianity had not yet fully spread in many parts of Europe, and this clearly indicates Ethiopia's Christian identity is very old and persistent. And another important point, Ethiopia is one of the few African countries that never completely fell under the sway of colonial powers. Even when European empires were occupying large parts of Africa, Ethiopia maintained a considerable degree of political and cultural independence. This independence impacted not only its politics, but also its religious traditions. Its Bible, its language, and its monastic tradition were less influenced by external pressures. While lists of religious texts were being finalized in Europe, deciding which books would be included and which would be removed in the mountains of Africa, some people were working on one task: preserving what they had found as it was. This is the difference between the stories of Rome and Ethiopia. On one hand, editing was going on the other, preservation. The monasteries built in the mountainous regions of Ethiopia were virtually isolated from the world. Towering mountains, silent valleys, and stone-hewn churches, like the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved into the rock beneath the ground, were not mere buildings. They were protective shields. The monks who lived here weren't working for any authority, nor were they writing the religious policy of any empire. Their sole purpose was to ensure that the sacred texts they had inherited would survive the ravages of time. These texts were written in the Ge'ez language. A few people in the world can read this language today, but for centuries it was the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The monks copied each word by hand. Imagine, no printing press, no computer, no scanner, just hands, ink, and patience. Copying a single manuscript would take months, sometimes years. Even a small mistake would force the entire work to begin again. This wasn't just writing, it was service. The tradition of Aksum is part of this story. The Ethiopians believe that the Ark of the Covenant, is kept safe in that region. Whether the world accepts it or not, this belief gave the people there a sense of being guardians of a deep ancient heritage. For them, the scriptures were not a subject of debate. They were an inheritance. When the Canon was being finalized in Rome, and some books became official and others were excluded, there was no such sifting in Ethiopia, and the church there incorporated whatever tradition it received. They didn't consider which books were politically safe. They simply preserved them. This is why, even today, the Ethiopian Bible contains more books. For centuries, the differences between the Ethiopian and Western Bibles have been debated, but mostly confined to the names of the books, which ones were included and which were excluded. Then AI came into the picture. When the Grok AI was asked to cross-reference the Ethiopian Canon and the Western Canon, it did the same thing as humans, but in a different way. Humans read and compare texts individually. The AI scans the entire system simultaneously. Words, sentences, themes, repeated patterns, everything at the same time. When Grok compared the two traditions, it flagged certain patterns. It wasn't just a matter of, this book is here, that's not there. It noticed that certain teachings, specific warnings, and post-resurrection events appeared repeatedly in the Ethiopian text, but were absent from the Western Bible. This is where researchers became more interested. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, former director of Princeton University's Institute of Semitic Studies, had been suggesting for decades that the Ethiopian tradition contained elements that may predate the Roman canon. He spent years working on these texts, but while scholars take a lifetime to reach conclusions from reading each manuscript, AI uncovered patterns in just a few weeks. The difference is this: humans delve deeply, but slowly. AI can piece together thousands of pages simultaneously. This doesn't mean AI is smarter than humans. Rather, its approach is different. Scholars understand context, the history of language, and the nuances of tradition. AI doesn't understand emotions or beliefs, but it can quickly detect hidden repetitions and discrepancies in data. This is why, when Grok flagged patterns, many scholars felt they had found technical confirmation of what they had been sensing for years. Now, the story gets really profound. In Ethiopian tradition, the text known as the Book of the Covenant isn't just an extra book. It's said to contain what Jesus said in the 40 days following his resurrection from the dead. We usually assume the resurrection story ends there. Jesus appeared, was seen by the people, and then ascended to heaven. But according to this text, much more was said, taught, and warned during those 40 days. Here, Jesus' voice doesn't sound like that of an ordinary teacher. He introduces himself as the King of heaven and earth. But this word king doesn't come with a throne or an army. He clearly states that his kingdom will not be spread by swords, politics, or power. His only weapon will be the Holy Spirit. That means inner strength, not external power. No army, no empire, just a spiritual power that works within hearts. In this same passage, he tells his disciples to go out into the world, not to conquer, but to transform. He warns that in times to come, people will use his name but distort his message. They will build huge temples, adorned with gold and stone, but will forget the true temple, the one within the human soul. This statement is strange to read because it sounds not just from an ancient era, but also from today's world. And then comes the heart-touching line, "Blessed are those who suffer for my name, not with words, but in silence." This isn't about faith shouted from a pulpit. It's about those who stand firm in their faith, without making a fuss or seeking recognition. Here, Jesus doesn't stand with the powerful and famous, but with those who are broken, those whom the world doesn't see. Another striking feature of these 40 days of teachings is Jesus' repeated emphasis on inner truth. He says that true change comes not from external systems, but from inner awakening. If the heart is not pure, any religious structure is hollow. If the intention is not true, any teaching remains just words. Now, if the Book of the Covenant was a book of emotions and grandiose words, didascalia is a book of down-to-earthness. Here, the topics are not about the heavens, but about everyday life. This text explains how one should live if they truly want to follow Christ. And it's not enough to simply believe, they must also live. First comes the topic of fasting and prayer. But fasting here doesn't simply mean giving up food. The real purpose is to overcome inner desires. Prayer doesn't simply mean repeating words, but rather looking within honestly. In today's world, where there's constant noise, phones, news, social media, stopping and sitting in silence is perhaps the greatest spiritual practice. Didascalia clearly says to stay away from corrupt rulers and greedy leaders. This statement sounds like a newspaper headline. Here, a leader isn't judged by their clothes, position, or grand platform. They are judged by how they treat the most vulnerable around them. If a leader grows rich while their people go hungry, they're not on the right path, no matter how big they talk. This text particularly emphasizes caring for widows, orphans, and the sick. And this means that true faith is seen where there is no gain. When you help someone who cannot repay you, that is the true test. In today's language, religion is not just about Sunday prayers or festivals. It is about everyday behavior, how you conduct yourself in your home, in your neighborhood, in your office. What is most interesting is that Didascalia doesn't see the church as a building. She says that the church is a network of people, a community that cares for one another. If the building stands but the people are broken, that church is incomplete. But if people support each other, that is the true church, even if it meets in a small room. Why Rome rejected them. The biggest question now arises. If these books had existed for centuries, why didn't Rome adopt them? Were they false? Or was there some other reason? Looking back at history, the Council of Nicaea took place in 325 AD, convened by the Roman Emperor Constantine. At that time, the Christianity was spreading rapidly, but so too were different beliefs and interpretations. The Roman Empire needed a religion that was uniform, controlled, and stable for the empire. This is where the process of determining the Canon began, which books would be considered authoritative and which would not. Imagine, if a text stated that no institution or priest was needed to reach God, it could pose a threat to the empire. Because if people began to connect directly with God, the role of the intermediary authority would be weakened. This was an aspect of political control, conforming religion to a framework that would maintain order. Another reason was mysticism. Ethiopian texts contain accounts of angels, spiritual experiences, and profound visions. These accounts are deeply personal and experiential. However, the Roman Church desired a religion that was clean, organized, and easy to teach. Too much mysticism could lead people to their own experiences, a disrupting uniformity. Therefore, such texts were considered too wild or too open. The third factor was fear. Professor Tedros Abraha, a recognized expert on Ethiopian Christian manuscripts, has long argued that the exclusion of these texts was not merely a result of theological debate, but a strategic decision. If certain texts challenged the power structure, removing them became an easy option. It was easier to say, "These are not authoritative," than to put them up for open debate. And it is important to understand that at that time, the Roman Empire wasn't just talking about religion, it was a political entity. It needed stability. A Bible that conveyed a consistent message, one that emphasized obedience and unity, was beneficial to it. Whereas texts that spoke of inner awakening, direct spiritual power, and distance from authority could create difficulties. To put the story in perspective, it can be said this: Christianity took two distinct paths. One was the systemic path, where structure, rank, rules, and obedience were paramount. The other was the awakening path, where a direct relationship between man and God was paramount. The Roman Empire needed a religion that united the people and maintained order, and obedience was essential to the functioning of the empire. If each person began to determine for themselves that they could connect directly with God, the power of the intermediary institution diminished. So, gradually, a model emerged in which faith was guided through the church, clergy, and system. This was the systemic path. In contrast, Ethiopia's experience was different. It was geographically isolated. Mountains, deserts, and distances largely separated it from Europe. When the Ethiopian Church never answered to the Pope, it maintained its own canon, its own language, and its own traditions. There, the belief that access to God did not require the approval of any political power was stronger. Faith was something that arose from within, not something imposed from above. This difference was not limited to Ethiopia and Rome. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in caves near the Dead Sea in the 20th century, information about an ancient community called the Essenes emerged. The Essenes also lived a quiet, disciplined, and simple spiritual life. They eschewed temple politics and emphasized a direct relationship with God. Many of their thinking and the teachings found in Ethiopian texts show similarities. This path of awakening wasn't the story of a single place. Throughout the early Christian world, the belief that the true temple was the human heart was widespread. But as the empire grew, a systematic model became more established. Rules, structures, and official texts began to emerge. Today, when we look back, it's clear that two currents coexisted, one based on control and order, and the other on inner light and direct spiritual experience. Both considered themselves part of the Christian tradition, but their emphasis differed. One said, "Go through the system." The other said, "Awaken within." Perhaps this is the true comparison: organization versus spirit, on control versus awakening. Life, death, and the soul. Teachings. Now the story reaches the most profound part: the understanding of life, death, and the soul. The teachings found in the Ethiopian tradition repeatedly state one thing: death is not the end. The body is described as a garment that wears out over time. But the soul, the true human being, is like fire, alive, glowing, and distinct from the body. When the body dies, the soul returns to its true source. The real fear, then, is not physical death, but something else. Here comes the concept of spiritual death. It's said that a person can be dead even while walking. Everything is fine on the outside: job, money, recognition, but empty on the inside. When a person is cut off from their inner light, when they become engrossed in mere noise and show, that is true death. This idea goes straight to the heart, because it's not something distant, but is connected to everyday life. And these teachings also state that every thought and every emotion has spiritual power. This means that what we think doesn't just remain in the mind, it leads us in a direction. Every thought is either a step toward light or toward darkness. This is also where the heavenly scrolls, teachings given in the 40 days following the resurrection, explain that the visible world around humanity is more than just a mere presence. Angels walk alongside, and there are whispers, both of good and of evil. Humans are constantly choosing which voice to listen to. An interesting idea is found in the description of two creators. One represents the true source of light, and the other represents the shadow. The shadow, filled with pride, created a world that is outwardly beautiful, but tinged with pain and confusion. This idea explains why good and evil are so entangled in the world. This also brings to mind a reference to Matthew 14. When Peter walks on water, but becomes afraid when he sees the wind and begins to sink. The message is clear. As long as the eye is focused on the light, there is balance. As soon as fear takes over, one begins to sink. Dr. Ralph Lee of Cambridge University, who researches Ethiopian biblical manuscripts, explains that these ideas are consistent with early Christian traditions, but later gradually disappeared from Western records. This means that this is not a sudden philosophy, but a very old trend. Well, what is the essence of all this? Life is not limited to the body. Death is not simply the cessation of breathing. The real question is whether the soul is alive. If a person is connected to the inner light, then he is truly alive. If he is disconnected from it, then even if he appears to be moving, he is extinguished from within. This is the deepest and perhaps most challenging aspect of this section. Now we come to what the Ethiopian writings call Jesus' last prophecy, the words he spoke just before ascending to heaven. If the earlier parts were profound, this part directly impacts the heart. Here the tone changes. It is not just a teaching, but a warning. It is said that Jesus told his disciples, "A time will come when love for the earth will diminish. People will chant the name of religion, but not from the heart. Worship will become a mere show. There will be huge platforms, powerful speeches, but the truth within will diminish." Religion will become a show. Lights, crowds, applause, but an emptiness within. Listening to this, it seems as if he is speaking not of some distant future, but of our own world. But amidst this darkness, he also made a promise. He said that a fire would come. But this fire would not be of destruction. It would be the fire of awakening. It would burn away lies, melt pride, and purify the soul. It would come not to bring down humanity, but to awaken it. Like a sleeping person suddenly opening his eyes and realizing what he had been missing all along. Most strikingly, he said, "My spirit will not rise in grand cathedrals, not through powerful religious leaders, but within broken people, on those who lack a platform, whose voices have been silenced, those who are considered weak by the world. That's where my voice will rise." He said that their voices will come from deserts, from mountains, and from places where people don't expect to hear them. This turns everything upside down. The truth will not be with the powerful, but with those who are often overlooked. Another striking line is, "I am the seed in the sword." This doesn't mean he was talking about violence. Rather, it means that even in the midst of dark times, a seed lies hidden, capable of bursting at the right time. In these very circumstances, conflict, fear, brokenness, the seeds of a new beginning are sown. It wasn't a theologian who revived this debate. It wasn't a church council. It was an AI system, Grok, created by Elon Musk's company. AI has no faith. It belongs to no sect. It is neither Catholic nor Orthodox. It simply looks at data. It recognizes patterns. It makes comparisons. And when it juxtaposes the Ethiopian and Western canons, the differences it uncovers have made people think. This is the irony. Technology designed to understand the future has begun to unravel the past. We typically think of AI as a thing of the future. But here it is, rereading 2,000-year-old words. Manuscripts preserved in the mountains by Ethiopians, copied by hand, whose language, Ge'ez, is readable by very few people today, are now being scanned by a machine. Ethiopia never abandoned these teachings. It quietly preserved them. It didn't fight the world, nor did it promote them. It simply preserved them. And now, through a technology that fears neither politics nor prestige, these things are being discussed again. Perhaps this is the answer to why now? Because today we have the tools to view thousands of pages simultaneously. Today's world is digital, and what was once confined to limited libraries can now become a global conversation. And the machines of the future have amplified the voices of the past. And perhaps this is the biggest turning point, that modern technology was needed to tell ancient truths. The question ultimately remains simple. If these books existed for nearly 2,000 years, if the Ethiopian Bible still contains 88 books, why haven't most of us heard about them before? Were they truly hidden, or simply never noticed? Whatever the difference, the fact remains that for 2,000 years this tradition survived in its mountains, its monasteries, and its language. And we continue to read our story in a world of 66 books. The 88 books still exist. This is not a rumor, not a new discovery. They were written, preserved, and read. The question isn't whether they exist or not. The question is, what else is there in them? Is there another aspect to the resurrection story? Is there a version of the early teachings that we've never heard? See, and if there's such a gap in one part of history, where else might our understanding be incomplete? This video doesn't force any conclusions. It simply opens the door. Whether or not to proceed is your decision. But if 2,000-year-old books still raise questions, perhaps they're worth a closer listen. What do you think? Does this change your perspective, or do you see it differently? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We'll read them. If this discussion made you think, like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future conversations like this.